It's probably the biggest case of modern slavery in Europe. A gang in Britain preyed on hundreds of vulnerable people from Poland. They put them to work, they took their money, and they kept them in rat-infested houses. Why is slavery still happening, and how can it be stopped? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. They were told they'd get jobs, they'd get money, and they would enjoy a new lifestyle. But hundreds of desperate people from Poland became victims of a huge slavery operation, and they were forced to live in horrific conditions. 8 members of a crime gang have now been jailed for a total of more than 55 years in the UK. But it's just one example of a growing international problem, as Joanna Ewart-James now reports.
It's been described as the most extensive, prolific, modern-day slavery network ever exposed in the UK. A human trafficking gang tricked hundreds of vulnerable people from Poland with the promise of work and a better life in Britain. But they exploited them and made millions of dollars for themselves.
Initially, everything seemed okay, but later on, they started treating me like a thief, following me, controlling me every step. You couldn't leave the house because you were being followed.
The gang, 5 men and 3 women, made their victims live in squalid, cramped, rat-infested conditions. Many were homeless, ex-prisoners or alcoholics who were forced to work for next to nothing.
We've dismantled an organised crime group which had exploited, to our knowledge, over 90 victims and probably over 200 victims in total because victims wouldn't come forward. We've put the main offenders from that group in custody for a long time.
With no electricity or hot water, victims washed in canals and were forced to go to soup kitchens to get a meal. Investigators believe it is the largest criminal prosecution of its type in Europe. But modern slavery isn't just a European problem. Latest figures from the International Labour Organization reveal an estimated 40 million people worldwide are living in slavery. More than 24 million are trapped in forced labour. And a quarter of the total, 10 million, are children. According to the rights group Walk Free Foundation, Britain is home to at least 136,000 modern slaves. As one of her last acts as Prime Minister, Theresa May is promising to bring it to an end.
No leader worthy of the name can look the other way while men, women and children are held against their will, forced to work for a pittance or no pay at all, routinely beaten, raped and tortured. Those of us who can speak out, who have a platform from which to be heard, have a duty, a moral duty, to raise our voices on their behalf.
It took British police and the Crown Prosecution Service nearly 4 years to bring this case to trial, and although other modern slavery investigations are underway, activists say the focus needs to be more on protecting victims. Joanna Ewart-James for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests, who are all joining us from London. Detective Superintendent Phil Brewer is the head of the Modern Slavery and Kidnap Unit at the Metropolitan Police. Joanna Ewart-James is the Executive Director of the advocacy group Freedom United. And Toby Cadman is an international human rights lawyer. Welcome to you all. I'd like to begin with Detective Superintendent Phil Brewer. Quite rightly, West Midlands Police Force are very proud of this operation. It's certainly a very significant operation. Just give us an idea of what type of scale of problem modern-day slavery actually is. Is it something that's much bigger than we perhaps realised before?
I think understanding is better, but absolutely, I think depending on the context that you put it in, and we talk about modern slavery, but if you expand that to exploitation, whether that's from a labour point of view, as this case highlighted, or one of the many other sort of facets of modern slavery, it's a significant issue, and there are a lot of people, the exploiters, making significant money out of other people's misery.
I mean, some of the reporting that I've read on this case was extraordinary. These guys, the people responsible, were driving around in Bentleys. They had access to bank accounts and There's a lot of money involved. What sort of numbers are we talking?
Well, I mean, the view is that modern slavery is probably only second to drugs in terms of criminal sort of money that you can make, and you can see why. You know, one of the unique factors of modern slavery is that your commodity, human beings, are reusable, and you can use them in so many different ways, and they continue to make you significant amounts of cash.
Let's bring in Joanna Ewart-James here. Joanna, when we say modern slavery, what do we actually mean by that? I mean, it's not whips and chains and people being shipped off in boats anymore, is it?
Well, absolutely. And I think that's part of the problem. Modern slavery is an umbrella term, and it encompasses lots of different forms of extreme exploitation, such as we saw in this case. And the use of chains and rope is something that we often see in pictures when modern slavery is described and illustrated, but it's actually far from the truth. And I think that's a real failure of the anti-slavery movement, which is why the problem really thrives today. Because if we don't recognise and understand, what it is that we're dealing with, cases of forced labour, of debt bondage, and then other forms such as domestic servitude, sexual exploitation, then it's not a surprise that it's often overlooked, and it takes a lot of work and effort to bring these cases to court.
So just to help us understand what modern day slavery might entail, so we're talking exploitation. For people in this particular case that the West Midlands Police broke open, their bank accounts have been taken over by the exploiters, that they were given very little money. They were kept in rat-infested houses. But that's just one part of it, isn't it? There's a lot more than that.
Yeah, I mean, those things are really indicators, and they should have been, these are the kind of signs that make you want to look further and find out if it does actually meet the definition of forced labour, for example, which is one of the common forms of modern slavery. And then we'd be looking for the fact that this work is given without being voluntarily offered. So and through coercion with some sort of threat or punishment. And this case is incredibly clear that all those aspects of forced labour were present. They were clearly coerced and threatened through various means. And the payment or the financial aspect is how the slave holders how they actually benefited from that control and effective ownership of those people.
Well, the trade is clearly global. Let me bring in Toby Cadman here. Toby, you're an international human rights lawyer. What is the international position here? Is there enough cooperation going on between Interpol, the UN, the EU, all the member states to be able to tackle this, or is everybody just simply discovering this now and not entirely sure what to do about it?
Well, I think that there are law enforcement agencies that are probably further along in dealing with this problem than other countries. I think the UK is very much advanced in the way that it is dealing with it, both in terms of the legislation that can be used and in terms of the investigative powers that are used. Other countries, it's also been highlighted just in the last week that there are very serious problems in Spain with the fruit picking industry, for example. And it doesn't sound like the traditional route for slavery, but it has been highlighted that Moroccan women have been used in very much the same ways as what we're seeing in the case that we're talking about today. So I think that there are countries that are further ahead. In terms of cross-border cooperation, obviously across the EU, that functions effectively. You mentioned the UN, but it's important to note that the UN doesn't have any criminal investigative capacity. That's not the role of the United Nations. It obviously highlights it as a human rights issue, but it doesn't necessarily get involved with the actual investigations, and that falls on national authorities to do. I think with many cases of this kind, where you're talking about cross-border crimes, that it is quite often the cooperation that breaks down between different states. Regrettably, that we see that in many different forms of organised crime. And of course, one of the I would say the biggest areas, or one of the biggest problems with cases of this kind is actually getting people to come forward, because very vulnerable people are used, vulnerable communities. It's very difficult to penetrate some of those communities, and it's set up in such a way that makes it very, very difficult for law enforcement to properly investigate.
Detective Superintendent Phil Brewer, what are your thoughts on that? It's very difficult to investigate these cases.
No, I'd agree with pretty much everything that Toby had said, and I think there's some key points there. I mean, the collaboration, particularly across Europe, is really good. And just to give you an example, within my team, we have an embedded Romanian officer, and that has helped us run a number of joint investigations with the Romanians. And the great thing about that type of joint work means we're not just dealing with what the end result, what we see in the UK. We actually have the opportunity to dismantle whole criminal networks and so prevent further victims from filling the void when we've managed to find victims and rescue them from that scenario. But it's key. They are really difficult. For example, some of the communities have very little trust in law enforcement. They're set up in a way that actually exploiters and the exploited are from the same community. And, to speak out against your community is effectively worse than actually trying to improve the situation that you find yourself in.
Let me bring in Joanna Ewart-James here. Just talk us through the difficulties faced when you have found these kinds of cases, when you're trying to help these people, not from a legal point of view, not from a police point of view, but from a perspective of, can you help these people if they don't want to be helped, if they don't want to be found?
I think really one of the big barriers to helping people such as those in this case, and you can see in this example, the organisation that really uncovered the scale of this trafficking ring spent years working with the community, but with these victims to get access to them. And I think that's a real societal question of recognising that this is a crime and that people have a right to freedom from slavery. And this particular case, I think, there's no question about the criminality of it. However, we see plenty of examples which are perhaps, to some people, less convincing. And it's on us to explain how controlling somebody in order to make gain through exploiting them and coercing them is not okay. And so our job is to explain how that actually manifests itself, because there are lots of different ways in which this crime is used and in which people find themselves in slavery. And whilst the conditions that these workers were held in are particularly abhorrent and the levels of violence were extreme, it's not actually that unusual. And we see in much more formal settings around the world, in supply chains or in private homes, situations that are really not that different. So we need to, one, recognise that this is something that nobody should go through, and two, make sure that people feel that they have the protection necessary, that going to the authorities isn't something that's going to cause a backlash against them. And one of the big tools that is used by exploiters is immigration law. And so one of the challenges we have is to make sure that the protections are there. So that a victim does not become a criminal of an immigration offence, but can be confident that they'll be recognised as their status as a victim and be treated as such and get the support they need to get out of that situation and to enjoy a life after that situation where they can be rehabilitated. And we're seeing that in so many cases that is still a massive challenge today.
So immigration law, one tool that can be used. Toby Cadman, what are the international tools that might be able to brought to bear on this problem? Are there things like legislation that could be passed? Are there protocols that could be put in place that will allow this trade to stop?
Well, I think that one of the points you have to understand is that as organised crime becomes increasingly transnational, it becomes more and more difficult to break it down and target crimes such as this. Do I think that the tools are there to remove it completely? No, I don't. I think it's far too big. It's far too powerful, and there's far too much money involved to just merely break it down. I don't necessarily think it's a question that there is a lack of legislation. I think there is ample legislation to deal with this, both in terms of criminal prosecutions and in terms of cooperation between states through mutual legal assistance and through creating joint investigative task forces between states. There's also sufficient guidelines, protocols at the level of the United Nations. So I don't think it's a question of creating more legal tools or enhancing the existing legal framework, which is already there and sufficient to prosecute. I think a lot of it, as I said, boils down to two or three core problems. One is getting people to speak out. Two is penetrating these communities and getting them to trust law enforcement. But also, I think it is also it's a question of being able to demonstrate a will to actually investigate and prosecute. Now, of course, as we've heard from Detective Superintendent Brewer, there is very clearly that desire to deal with that on the EU level. But there are still EU states that are not confronting this. And I go back to the case in Spain, just because that's a case that we're involved in. And here you have numerous complaints being made. You have victims coming forward. There is a legal framework in Spain to deal with it, and they're not dealing with it. They're not investigating it. The authorities are turning a blind eye to this. And there are allegations against law enforcement itself in Spain that they are complicit in a lot of what is going on. So I think that, yes, there's a question that you need to create greater awareness. I think it is a far bigger problem than most people would readily admit. It is a very serious problem, and it's getting worse. And I think the case that we've seen, successful prosecution, can have an impact on targeting this, but it is largely going to depend upon greater cooperation between states in transnational prosecutions, and that's where I think the point is lacking. Regrettably, there is no international jurisdiction to deal with this on the level of the International Criminal Court or an equivalent body. So the only international jurisdiction you have is not really going to address the core problem, because that's human rights awareness, human rights monitoring. That's not sending any deterrent message to these criminal gangs that flourish by the lack of coordination and the lack of accountability.
Let's bring in Detective Superintendent Phil Brewer here. There are other issues. It's not just about international law, transnational and organised crime across borders, which clearly is, one of the drivers of this. It's a lucrative business. But in your investigations, it seems to me that there must be some sort of tacit cooperation between the people who are actually employing these gangmasters, the people that employed these people to get these people to get to work in their fields for them. It's a bit convoluted, I know, but surely they must have known what they were getting into. You can't get cheap labour without a cost somewhere, surely.
Yeah, it depends really. We see, I was to put it into sort of two simple categories. We see direct exploitation, which absolutely the employers must know, they must be aware because of the money that they're paying the gangmasters, that something isn't right, that people are earning well below the minimum wage, so they have to be exploited. But we're also seeing a rising trend in the number of people who appear to be employed legitimately. So as far as the employers are aware, they are paying the minimum wage or more. They're paying money direct into bank accounts. But the fact is, in the background, those exploiters are controlling those bank accounts. And that is very, very hard to put any process in place to prevent, without significant and intrusive looking at how people live their lives. And that doesn't necessarily sit with an employer. But it is a complex issue. And one of the challenges will always be is that as we up the ante in terms of law enforcement activity within this area, the exploiters become more smarter and start putting safeguards in place to prevent them being prosecuted.
Joanna Ewart-James, is the employers an issue for you, the people that actually pay the gangmasters? Is that something that you think is worth pursuing in order to try and change things?
Well, Freedom United, we take a social movement approach to this problem. And I think it works very well even in this case and the case that my fellow panellists are describing elsewhere in the world. And that is that, whilst there isn't a movement of people who understand and who share the idea that this sort of form of exploitation is not only unacceptable, but everything should be done to stop it and to make sure that people, whoever they are, can live freely, then it's not going to happen. I mean, we heard about how there is a question around the Spanish police's role in investigating. Well, if there's no real will from society in general, it's not surprising that there's no pressure on the police to investigate. And we've seen a big change in the UK where the awareness levels have raised significantly, and it gives space and it gives will and it gives power, and it means that we can move further more quickly because we know what we're looking for. We've still got a long way to go, without a doubt, but it is at every level of society. I mean, in this particular case, we know that a paramedic visited the home, I understand, when one of the workers died. It's reported that the slaveholder, let's say, took the ID out of this worker's pocket so that he couldn't be identified. But still, that paramedic would have seen the conditions in which that person was living. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that paramedics or anybody else in society should be performing the role of law enforcement. But these are all opportunities that could raise alarm bells and trigger an investigation process. Because, as we know, it is very difficult to either expect all the responsibility to be on the victim to come forward or on the law enforcement to be able to access. This needs to be a societal solution. And so for that reason, yes, the employers have a liability to be sure that they're doing everything that they can do to check that the labour that goes into their supply chain is legitimate. But also, as society, all of us, just need to be well educated on what it is that we're looking for and be clear about the fact that this isn't something that we accept in our society.
We are running short on time, but I do want to ask a question to Detective Superintendent Phil Brewer. You heard there about the idea that, members of society can help. That people, if they notice these patterns of behaviour that might be linked to exploitation, they can come forward, they can do that. However, at that stage, it's too late, isn't it? Where do we need to stop this at the border, surely? We need to stop this at the international criminal gang level. That's where, is that where you should be concentrating your firepower, as it were?
I think there's a number of different fronts that we should be concentrating on, and absolutely, with those, if members of the public take the time to contact us or to contact the Modern Slavery Helpline with suspicions, then absolutely we need to act on that. But you're right. This is bigger than that, and there is work that needs to be done at government level to look at how we're making people vulnerable in the first place, and actually working collaboratively to try and reduce the chances of someone finding themselves in a situation where they're being exploited, and that isn't just the policing situation, and I hate to use a cliche, but we can't police our way out modern slavery. And as Joanna said, this is a role for everyone in society, whatever walk of life, whatever your role may be. It's actually working together to try and make a difference, and that is the only way we'll really make a difference in terms of reducing the risk to vulnerable individuals that find themselves in these situations.
I want to thank all our guests, Detective Superintendent Phil Brewer, Joanna Ewart-James and Toby Cadman. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.